I didn't stay because I wanted to. I stayed because leaving felt too final. That's the truth I avoided for years. When people talk about escape, they imagine courage packing a bag, closing a door, starting over somewhere else. They imagine movement. Action. A clean break from something broken. My story is quieter than that. I didn't leave. I faded. At first, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like patience. Like loyalty. Like giving things time to improve. I told myself that not everything needs an ending, that some situations resolve on their own if you don't disturb them. So I stayed. I stayed in conversations that no longer reached me. I stayed in routines that felt hollow. I stayed in a life that had stopped asking who I was. I didn't protest. I didn't collapse. I didn't make a scene. I simply learned how to exist with less. Less expectation. Less desire. Less voice. That adjustment felt practical. Mature. Responsible. No one questioned it. From the outside, my life looked intact. There were no obvious signs of suffering. No dramatic decline. I was functional. Present. Reliable. Inside, something was slowly dissolving. I remember when I first noticed it. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't despair. It was absence. A strange blankness where reactions used to be. Things that once bothered me stopped registering. Things that once excited me barely moved the needle. I told myself this was adulthood. That this was what happens when you grow up. The edges soften, the intensity fades, life becomes quieter. But this wasn't quiet. It was empty. Leaving would have required confrontation. It would have forced me to admit that something was wrong, that what I had invested time and energy into wasn't working, that I needed something different. That felt dangerous. Not because of logistics or fear of change, but because leaving would have required me to acknowledge myself fully. My needs. My limits. My dissatisfaction. Staying allowed me to postpone that reckoning. So I stayed, and I adjusted. I stopped asking questions that led nowhere. I stopped expressing thoughts that complicated things. I stopped noticing how disconnected I felt. I became skilled at existing on the surface of my own life. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from staying somewhere you no longer belong. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being present without participation. I would sit in rooms where conversations happened around me, and feel like a ghost. I was there, but not entirely. My responses were appropriate, my expressions convincing, my presence unchallenged. No one noticed I was fading. That's the danger of quiet disappearances. They don't alarm anyone. They don't create urgency. They don't demand intervention. They are efficient. I told myself that leaving would hurt people. That it would create instability. That it would raise questions I didn't want to answer. I told myself staying was kinder. What I didn't admit was that leaving would have hurt me too, in a way I didn't know how to survive yet. So instead of leaving, I made myself smaller. I stopped wanting things out loud. I stopped imagining alternatives. I stopped believing that my discomfort meant anything. I began measuring my life by how little disruption it caused. That metric is dangerous. Because when disruption becomes the enemy, authenticity becomes expendable. Years passed this way. Not empty years, busy ones. Structured ones. Externally productive. Internally static. I can't point to milestones, only maintenance. I can't recall emotions clearly, only responsibilities. I told myself this was stability. But stability without presence is just stagnation with better branding. The realization came not as a breakdown, but as a quiet horror. I was thinking about leaving, not practically, just abstractly, and I realized something terrifying. I no longer knew what I would be leaving for. Not because nothing was wrong but because I had dulled myself enough that desire felt unfamiliar. I had been fading so long that the idea of a different life felt theoretical, not urgent. That's when it hit me. I hadn't stayed because I was committed. I had stayed because I was disappearing. Leaving would have required me to reclaim myself, and I wasn't sure there was enough of me left to reclaim. That thought settled heavily in my chest. Because fading isn't something you can point to and say, this is when it happened. It happens gradually, through small accommodations and quiet resignations, until one day you realize you are still there but you are no longer fully present. And once you notice that, the question becomes unavoidable: if you don't leave, what exactly remains of you? Once I realized I had faded instead of leaving, I expected urgency to finally arrive. A moment of panic. A breaking point. Some inner command that would force me to act. It didn't. What came instead was a strange calm, the kind that settles in after you've already given up something important. The kind that feels like peace, until you notice how little is left to protect. I began to understand that fading is seductive because it feels safe. You don't have to confront anyone. You don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to risk being wrong. You just withdraw slowly enough that no one asks questions. That's what I had done. Every time something felt misaligned, I pulled back a little more. I reduced expectations. I shortened emotional reach. I learned how to function with less connection, less engagement, less risk. I told myself this was adaptation. What it really was erosion. I started noticing how often I avoided moments that required presence. Conversations that might lead somewhere uncomfortable. Decisions that demanded commitment. Emotions that wanted to be expressed. I chose neutrality instead. Neutrality feels mature. It feels balanced. It feels like you're above the mess, but neutrality, sustained long enough, empties you of contrast. Without contrast, nothing feels alive. I wasn't miserable. I was numb. That distinction mattered, because numbness doesn't trigger alarms. You don't seek help when nothing hurts sharply enough. You don't leave when staying doesn't actively wound you. You just remain. I asked myself why leaving still felt impossible. The answer surprised me. It wasn't fear of loss. It was fear of acknowledgement. Leaving would have meant admitting that I had been unhappy for a long time. That I had invested years into something that no longer fit. That I had stayed too long out of hope, loyalty, or inertia. Leaving would have turned fading into failure, and I wasn't ready to name it that. So I stayed and told myself a quieter story. That things weren't perfect, but nothing is. That discomfort is part of life. That wanting more is unrealistic. Those thoughts weren't false. They were incomplete in a way that kept me stuck. I began to see how much of my identity had reorganized around staying. I became the one who endured. Who didn't rock the boat. Who was reliable even when unfulfilled. People praised that about me. They didn't know the cost. Endurance is admirable until it replaces agency. I realized that I had stopped imagining myself elsewhere, not because I was content, but because imagining alternatives had become painful. Desire hurt. It reminded me of what I wasn't choosing. So I dulled it. I stopped asking what I wanted. I stopped checking how I felt. I stopped noticing my own reactions. That self-neglect didn't feel violent. It felt responsible. The most unsettling part was how normal it became. Days blended together. Weeks passed without distinction. I wasn't counting time anymore, I was filling it. That's when the question that terrified me began to surface quietly, again and again: if nothing changes, will this be my life? Not dramatically. Not tragically. Just, permanently. I didn't hate my life. I just wasn't in it. I began to understand that fading isn't about being weak. It's about being tired of choosing. Tired of explaining. Tired of confronting the gap between who you are and where you are. Fading lets you exist without deciding. But existing without deciding comes at a cost. You lose authorship. Your life becomes something that happens around you while you remain technically present. You participate just enough to maintain continuity, but not enough to feel ownership. I realized then that leaving was no longer just about changing circumstances. It was about reclaiming presence. And that scared me more than leaving ever had. Because presence means accountability. It means feeling disappointment instead of avoiding it. It means risking regret instead of numbing it. Fading had protected me from those feelings. But it had also protected me from myself. I started to notice moments where I still had a choice, not about leaving, but about re-entering. Small moments where I could speak instead of withdrawing. Engage instead of enduring. Acknowledge instead of minimizing. Those moments felt uncomfortable. But they also felt real. For the first time in a long while, discomfort felt like a signal, not something to be suppressed, but something pointing somewhere important. I didn't know yet whether I would leave. I didn't know if leaving was even the right word anymore. What I knew was this: if I continued fading, there would be nothing left to leave. And that realization was heavier than any fear I had avoided by staying. I thought leaving would be a moment. A decision. A door closing. A clear before and after. What I learned instead is that before you can leave a place, you have to return to yourself. And I wasn't there yet. I didn't suddenly pack my life into boxes or announce a turning point. What I did was smaller and much harder. I stopped fading. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Fading had become my default response to discomfort. Whenever something felt heavy, I withdrew. Whenever something demanded clarity, I softened. Whenever I felt unseen, I made myself easier to ignore. Stopping that meant staying present when every instinct told me to disappear. The first time I did it, I felt exposed in a way I hadn't in years. I expressed a need without cushioning it. I admitted dissatisfaction without immediately explaining it away. I allowed silence to exist without filling it with reassurance. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was terrifying. Because it meant I had been hiding from moments that could have held me all along. I began to understand that leaving isn't always about geography or circumstance. Sometimes it's about refusing to abandon yourself where you are. I didn't leave right away. I stayed, but differently. I spoke when I felt the urge to withdraw. I named things that had previously gone unspoken. I stopped reducing myself to fit the space. Some people welcomed that shift. Some didn't. Some seemed uncomfortable, as if they were meeting me for the first time. In a way, they were. And so was I. The more present I became, the clearer everything felt. Not easier, clearer. I could finally see the shape of my dissatisfaction instead of just feeling its weight. I could distinguish between what was salvageable and what had already ended quietly. That clarity brought grief. Grief for the years I had faded instead of choosing. Grief for the parts of myself I had dimmed to stay. Grief for the fact that leaving earlier would have been kinder to everyone, including me. But grief, unlike numbness, moves. It doesn't trap you in place. It passes through and leaves space behind. And in that space, something unexpected appeared. Agency. I realized I didn't need a dramatic exit to reclaim myself. I needed to stop disappearing in my own life. I needed to let myself be fully present long enough to know whether staying was a choice or a habit. Once I did that, the answer became obvious. Staying wasn't wrong. Fading was. Leaving, when it finally happened, wasn't fueled by panic or desperation. It was quiet. Deliberate. Almost gentle. Because by then, I wasn't escaping, I was moving towards something. Myself. I didn't leave to punish anyone. I didn't leave to prove anything. I left because I could finally feel the difference between endurance and erasure. and I refuse to keep choosing the latter. If you're listening to this and you feel like you've been fading staying somewhere physically while leaving emotionally, I want you to understand this: leaving doesn't always begin with walking away. Sometimes it begins with stopping the slow disappearance. With speaking once instead of withdrawing. With wanting something instead of numbing it. With acknowledging discomfort instead of neutralizing it. You don't have to make everything dramatic to make it real. I let myself fade instead of leaving because fading felt safer than facing the truth. The truth was that staying without presence was costing me more than leaving ever could. I didn't recover everything I lost to fading. Sometime doesn't come back. Some versions of myself remain theoretical. But I reclaimed something essential. My ability to be here. Fully. Honestly. Without reducing myself to survive. That's where my life finally resumed, not at the moment I left, but at the moment I stopped disappearing. And that, after all the years of fading, was the most decisive act I had ever made.